So hi everyone, thank you for this last seminar for the IGCP648 virtual seminar series. So today we have Veronique Le Roux with us, and she will be presenting water in the Earth's mantle story from the Earth's abyss. So if I'm correct, Veronique Le Roux is currently at Woods Hole, right? And she is working basically on the water and halogen budget of mantle and crystal reservoir, mechanism of slab material transfer in subduction zone, and mantle oceanography and magma rock interaction, processes and consequences of mantle rock alterations. So in this presentation, as I say, Veronique will present us the role of water in the mantle and what we can learn on this topic. So Veronique, the audience is all yours.
Okay, thank you. So so I'm going to talk about water in the Earth's mantle story from the ocean's abyss. I was wondering how many people would show up at like 10 p.m. Perth time and 1 a.m. Sydney time. Anyway, I did my talk like with a few like Australian reference in mind. I don't even know if anyone is in Australia physically. I guess, Luc, you are in Australia right now. So thank you for being there at 10 p.m.
Yes, I am.
So anyway, I just wanted to like have this blank screen to like try to connect with the audience. If anyone else is in Australia as well, thank you so much. For people who are not in Australia, I just wanted to say that I have a special connection to Australia. I actually did part of my PhD in Sydney in 2007. And oh, thank you, Render, for turning on your camera. It's great. So I have a special connection with Australia. I did a collaboration. I was in Sydney for 6 months and doing isotope geochemistry, actually. And this picture here is because this past summer I went back to Brittany, where my hometown is, and I took the picture on the right, which is in Brittany, and then it reminded me of a hike I took near Byron Bay in Australia, which was the picture on the left. So I was like, oh, look, like Brittany kind of looks like Australia. Obviously, in my memory, it was more similar than now when I look at the picture. But yeah, while I was in Australia, it was like such a great time. So thank you for inviting me, because it was an opportunity for me to actually look at my pictures back in 2007, where I was fairly obsessed with wildlife at the time, and still now, actually. So let's dive into the talk, and I just wanted to give a little bit of reminder of where water is on Earth. Obviously, we know that water is, we see water in the ocean, and it's we think of water primarily as H2 molecules in the atmosphere and the ocean. But water in our planet is also incorporated in the form of hydrogen in minerals in the deep Earth. And so when you think about water or hydrogen, actually there's a lot of hydrogen in minerals that we imagine mostly as dry, which we call nominally anhydrous minerals, such as olivine and pyroxene, which are contained in the rocks that form the mantle of the Earth. And then there's, of course, the hydrous minerals that we know well, such as amphibole and micas, serpentine, who have like the OH and H2O form of water. So lots of water, hydrogen, H2O, OH, incorporated in various species on Earth. And people have, of course, tried to assess how much water is in the inside of the Earth. And those estimates vary greatly. In a recent paper from peridotit in 2017, they present some possibility that there's lots of hydrogen that partition to the core. Other people think that it would be a little bit less hydrogen, mostly stored in the lower mantle, and then you can see all the way to the right. Do you see my cursor when I move that? Okay, yeah. So all the way to the right, that you would have lots of water in the transition zone, but maybe not as much water overall. And some people say that it could be like a 1-to-1. So there's as much water in the ocean as there is in the deep Earth. So we're not going to tackle that problem today, but it's just to let you know that I think there's still lots of work to be done to try to understand how much hydrogen / water there is in the deep Earth interior. So today we are going to look specifically at water variation in the upper mantle, so down to 400-kilometer depth. And the upper mantle, it's interesting because we actually have samples from the upper mantle that are available at the surface of the planet. So just a quick reminder, I don't know any of you guys, so I'm not sure how familiar you are with petrology and the mantle. So I apologize if it's too simple, but if you do not understand, please feel free to unmute and ask me a question, because again, we're like just a small room, so it's the opportunity to discuss. So the upper mantle is mostly made of the rock peridotit, which is a silica and magnesium-rich rock. And as I said, we have those rocks are made primarily of olivine and pyroxene and an aluminum-rich phase, which can be plagioclase, spinel, or garnet. And the mantle rocks, which represent the upper mantle that I just talked about, are exhumed in volcanoes, xenolith, at convergent plate boundaries, in mountain chains, and at oceanic ridges in the middle of the ocean, especially in the slow-spreading ridges. You have access to those rocks from the mantle that are exhumed through tectonics. So lots of mantle rocks available all over the planet. I mean, they're pretty rare statistically, but we still have a lot of outcrops to try and sample that upper mantle. So the question is, of course, why is water important in the upper mantle? So people have suggested that when you add water or hydrogen, you can increase the diffusivity of the other components that form the rock, the other ions, and that could have an effect on viscosity. So for example, on that figure, where we show the depth versus viscosity and water concentration in both axes, we can see that the viscosity increases the viscosity increases as we reduce the water content here. We also, of course, have an effect of temperature, but people have suggested that the fact that we are melting the mantle and basically removing hydrogen water from those rocks, it makes them more viscous, in addition to the temperature effect. This is just another illustration. People disagree a little bit on how much effect the water has on viscosity. So again, there is more work to be done if some of you are interested in that. But you can see on that graph the viscosity versus the depth, and you can see, depending on how much water you have in that rock, obviously for at the same depth, you have a much more viscous rock if you have less water. So that is one of the effects of water on mantle rocks. Water will also modify how the rocks melt. So for example, on that figure, we have the H2 content in mantle rocks versus the melt fraction. And you can see that at the same, you can see that for the same temperature, if you have less water, then the melt fraction is lower than if you have more water here. So those are from experiments. So you can have very small variations in water. Of course, there's not a lot of hydrogen in a specific rock, but because the volume of the mantle is gigantic, it's more than 80% of the planet, the mantle as a whole, just a little bit of hydrogen adds up. And so small variation in water and hydrogen can actually have significant effects on the melting behavior and the rheology of those rocks. I wanted to remind you of the two main methods that have been used to determine the water content in the upper mantle of our planet. The first one is to look at the water content of mid-ocean ridge basalt, the MORB, and I call that the indirect method because we're looking at the volcanic product of that source that we are interested in. So the MORB, the mid-ocean ridge basalt, they reflect the asthenspheric, convecting mantle source, and we think that from the MORB, we think that that source of the MORB contains from 50 to 250 ppm water. So it's a small amount, but that is what the estimates are saying. And this is based on geochemical assumptions like the fact that the H2O versus cerium ratio in MORB is fairly constant. And so we calculate, like, if we know how much cerium there is, then we calculate how much water there is. There's some limitation to that method, several limitations, although, you know, it probably gives us a pretty rough estimate. But if you look at water cerium ratio in mid-ocean ridge results, there's actually quite a variability. So the water cerium ratio might not be constant all the time. So it can be fractionated. The other limitation of using MORB to go back to the astenospheric mantle is that the MORB composition, they tend to reflect the lithologies that want to melt the most. And so if you have, let's say, an extremely depleted mantle veined with a bunch of peroxenites that melt, well, that MORB will tend to reflect the most fertile lithologies, the lithologies that want to melt. So the water content of MORB is an average of a big volume, not necessarily accurately reflecting the H2O and the mantle source. But, you know, that's what we can do so far. So the other method is, of course, to look directly at the source, at the mantle rocks. We can't go directly in the asthenosphere and measure it, but what we have are mantle-derived rocks, such as xenolith. Or, you know, other types of localities, but I'm just going to mention xenolith here. And the xenolith and the mantle rocks that we sample at the surface of the Earth typically reflect the lithospheric mantle source, so the residue, the cold residue after melting. And that lithospheric mantle typically contains from near nothing to maybe 200 ppm or so. This is an example from that review paper, really nice review paper. I encourage you to read it if you have not. This shows the depth versus the concentration in water in both minerals and in both peridotites. The main message is that it's really, really variable. There's very large variation in both the bulk and the mineral concentration in the xenolith record that we have on Earth. One of the reason why it's sometimes difficult to interpret those hydrogen variability is that hydrogen is often too high. The concentrations are often too high to be explained purely by partial melting. And it's often that we observe that hydrogen does not correlate with other major elements or minor elements or trace elements. So there's, of course, a lot of uncertainties on the processes that will control those water variations in those xenoliths and those minerals. I think it's important to also understand the differences between those two records that I just talked about. On the left, I'm just showing how MORB, the mid-ocean ridge result, are the mantle melts, and they will sample very large volume of an astenospheric mantle. So maybe like more than 100 cubic kilometer. It's a diluted average composition. We don't really know exactly what the source is made of, and we have, you know, some sort of average of water balances in the asthenosphere. But the xenolith, which are the actual pieces of mantle or residual mantle, they're typically very small, right? Like hand samples. So they're very small volume. They just give us a quick snapshot, and they represent the residual lithospheric mantle, which could have been modified by metasomatism and a whole bunch of other processes. So we're not necessarily looking exactly at the same record. So the concentrations and the estimates of water abundances in those two reservoirs, if you want, which we typically call the mantle, the upper mantle, are similar. They broadly agree, but they don't really agree for the right reasons. There's no reason why they should necessarily agree in all places. Because, as I said, we're sampling asthenosphere versus lithosphere. The xenolith may record metasomatism, subsolidus reequilibration, more diffusion processes on average. So it's, of course, the two records have their own limitation. There's one record that has been studied less, and that's what we are going to focus on today, is the the record of abyssal peridotites. And the abyssal peridotites are the peridotites, of course, that outcrop at mid-ocean ridges. Thank you, Jamal, for turning on your camera. Very appreciated. So the abyssal peridotites, they outcrop at slow spreading ridges, typically, or ultra slow. And they represent peridotites that were very recently, geological timescale, a few million years, they were very recently part of the asthenosphere. They were part of the source of morph. So I think that they are a nice complementary product to the morph record. Sorry, I'm just mirroring. They are complementary to the morph record, but they are rarely studied for volatiles. So we are going to dive at the bottom of the VMA fracture zone. And the VMA fracture zone is in the equatorial Atlantic. If you actually trace the trace of the VMA fracture zone, you arrive like right in the middle of the Caribbean, of the Antilles arc. So the VMA fracture zone, that is a rendering of what it would look like at depth if you could dive there. And it's an exceptional zone because it's like hundreds of kilometers, 200 to 300 kilometers of exposures of more and abyssal peridotites, which basically give you a time series of 25 million years of continuous record of mantle rocks on the seafloor. So potentially 25 million years record on water variation in the upper mantle. So those rocks that I have studied, they were recovered mainly through my collaborator Enrico Bonatti in several cruises a while ago. And they were recovered through a combination of dredges and dives, in the 80s and up to 2000. So the reason why abyssal peridotites are usually not studied is because they don't look very nice. They're very altered. Of course, there's hydrothermal alteration at the seafloor. So if you look at the mantle xenolith on the right, that would be what a typical nice mantle xenolith would look like. And unfortunately, on the right, that's what an abyssal peridotite would look like at VMA. Now, you can see that there's still hope. There's a little bit of cores that are still unaltered, and that's really what we're interested in. We're not interested in analyzing the serpentine, the low temperature alteration, because of course that adds water. We are interested in the water variability in the preserved core of those abyssal peridotites. So if it's 100% serpentinized, there's no hope. Those abyssal peridotites at VMA, the degree of serpentinization varies between 70 and 75% or so. So they're generally altered. So there are not a whole lot of studies on them. I have a small list of other studies who have worked on those at the very end of my talk. So I just want to point out that I'm not the only one who has tried to analyze water in those, but it's very limited. This is just to give you a little bit of context about what's going on at VMA. So again, we have the ridge, and we have abyssal peridotites exposed like this, and up to like 0 million year approximately at the ridge, to 25 million year to the west. So it's a 25 million year record, 300 kilometer, and what is happening at VMA, what previous studies have shown, is that the degree of melting has increased from 25 million years to approximately today. So that was based on geochemical tracers like titanium, zircon, TPX, and chrome number and spinel. This has been known for a while, so there are some variability within that timeline, and we're going to see how the water may vary with those other geochemical tracers. A recent study a few years ago has shown that not only there's an increase in the degree of melting from 25 million years to today, there's probably a change in the composition of the source that has fed the basalts at VIMA. I'm not going to go into the geochemical detail of that study, but the take-home message of that study is that 25 million years ago, the source was mostly composed of peridotit and pyroxenites, so very pyroxene-rich rocks. And gradually, it has moved on to a source that is more dominated by peridotit only. So we also have that information to interpret our data. Now, just a little bit of a picture of the instrument that I've used. This is called a secondary ion mass spectrometer. And we have one, we're lucky to have one at Woods Hole. It's just downstairs as I speak. And so that instrument, it allows for high resolution, high precision, high spatial resolution, volatile measurements. So I've analyzed water and a series of other elements that I'm not going to talk about today. And we have my colleague Catherine on the picture. It's a really fun instrument to use when it doesn't break. And then this mount here on the right-hand side just shows how we typically prepare the samples. You take some grains and you mount them in the metal indium to minimize all the background and any contamination. So there's a lot of prep work. And then, of course, you want to know if you have good quality data. Those are just calibration curves. We typically have reference material to check if we can properly convert our counts to concentration. I'm going to skip on that, like, to not bore you with that. We, of course, compare, we check the background. If you're interested in that, feel free to email me to know how we're doing that. We're checking the background, we're correcting for the background if it's too high. And then finally, we can analyze our grains and get concentration. Be like, okay, what's going on? So here, let's just look at those two plots actually show the same thing. So let's just focus, for example, on the left-hand side plot. Here, I'm showing the water content in CPX versus the age in million year at VIMA. So 0 would be the peridotites that are the most recent, and then the 25 million year peridotit here are the oldest. And I have colored those just for visually so that you can better see, hopefully. And so we observe something that we were not necessarily expecting. We observe actually a nice systematic change in water content with crustal ages, where as the peridotit gets younger and younger, we're observing an increase in the water content of those minerals for both the CPX, the cliopyroxene, and the orthopyroxene, which are the two types of pyroxene that are present in the VIMA peridotites. So although people have analyzed some water content of abyssal peridotites, it's the first time, to my knowledge, that we have seen a time series where such a systematic trend has been observed with the age of peridotites. So what do they mean? And at this point, I was thinking, well, maybe people need a break because it's like a lot of geochemistry. So I thought I'm going to have like a cute Australian animal intermission. Just to like chill, because this is the popular spot 2 days before Christmas. So I know that everyone is like very ready to work. Those two pictures are, actually I was not a birder at that time, but I think this is a rainbow lorikeet on the balcony. I had no idea, I just thought it was a cute bird. And then of course, a kangaroo, you have to like go and pet a kangaroo if you're in Australia. So anyway, sorry for that, that pause, that break, but I think sometimes it's nice in the middle of geochemistry to just have a little bit of a brain break. So now you're dying to know, like, Vera, what do they mean, those trends? Okay, I'm going to tell you. So we have to think about a bunch of solutions, right? Those trends can mean a lot of things. So let's see one hypothesis at a time what they could mean. The first thing is, you remember they're super altered, those rocks. So I wanted to make sure that those were not linked to the degree of serpentization. The degree of serpentization actually at VIMA is very, very similar. So we I don't think those increases in the water content are linked to an increase in the degree of serpentinization, because when you analyze a fresh core, if there's a little bit of serpentinization, you see it with the chlorine content, you see it sometimes, with other elements, or you see it with the standard error if your analysis is going up and down because you're like hitting heterogeneous altered inclusion. So I don't think it's serpentinization. The other thing is, some of those grains, a subset of those grains, have actually been analyzed by FTIR, which is another technique where you can distinguish whether the hydrogen that you're analyzing is from a primary hydrogen in the pyroxene, or if it's a serpentinization OH hydrogen. And all the FTIR analysis, thank you, Mauro, for turning on your camera. It's great. So you can see actually that, the FTIR analysis also give high water content, water abundances in those pyroxenes, so, which is not related to a serpentinization signal. So a lot of evidence to tell me that this is not a serpentinization signal. The other thing is hydrogen is an element that can diffuse fast if it's given the opportunity. And so redistribution during subsolidus cooling could be expected in those rocks. I think it's happening because the rocks have experienced subsolidus cooling. But if we plot the water content in the pyroxene versus the temperature of reequilibration for any thermometer that you want, there's no robust correlation that's observed between the temperature of reequilibration and the water content of the pyroxene. So I don't think that subsolidus cooling is the main process that is controlling this increase with time. So now we can estimate whether the hydrogen abundances are consistent with residual values. Abyssal peridotites have melted, so they are residual rocks. So maybe the hydrogen content reflects the hydrogen content that we would expect after melting. First, we're going to look at rare earth elements such as samarium and ytterbium, and we can make very simple melting models in a spinel melting field and garnet plus spinel melting field. And although it's not perfect, we can see that most of the rare elements can be explained by just a peridotite that melts, and that is a residue of melting, and that is consistent with experiments, that is consistent with the model. Okay, so the rare earth elements, which are also incompatible elements, just like hydrogen, which means they want to go and melt, they are consistent with being residual concentration after melting. If we do the same for hydrogen and we use partition coefficients from experiments and we do the melting models, and I'm just gonna have to move your faces over to see my figure. Okay, and so if you do that, the same for hydrogen, you can see that the hydrogen content of those rocks should actually go down pretty quickly, but we are seeing much more water than expected if the hydrogen concentrations were just residual after melting. So hydrogen is like much more enriched than what we are expecting if we're just considering a melting process. So it's not serpentinization. At least the main process is not serpentinization. It's not subsolidus cooling. It's not melting because there's way too much hydrogen. And what is that again? Okay, H2O concentration. This is H2O concentration versus the melt fraction. Yeah, and so the other funny thing that we observed is that actually, as the melting degree of the rock increased, the water content of the minerals increased. And that's exactly the opposite of what you would expect. As you would melt a rock, it's like if you have a sponge full of water and you melt it, so you press and the water goes out, like the melt would go out, then you would expect to have like a dry residue. The sponge wouldn't have water anymore. And what we are seeing is that the more depleted the rocks are, the more water they have. So that was also very unexpected. So it's also opposite to the observation that we typically make in mantle-derived xenolith. Another process that could be happening is we know that there's a lot of melt metasomatism happening in abyssal peridotites. And you have to bear with me on that because I want to say that the water content is not controlled by modal metasomatism. And when I talk about modal metasomatism, I imagine a melt going into a rock and recrystallizing new phases. That's the definition of modal. You are changing the modal proportion of the rock as you metasomatize a rock. If you do that, then other elements would increase with water. For example, sodium. So if you plot the water concentration in the pyroxene versus the sodium content, we actually see a negative correlation. And if it was modal metasomatism, you would probably expect a positive correlation between the water content and the tracers, the geochemical tracers of modal metasomatism. So it's not a melt that is crystallizing new phases that seems to do that. But what I think is happening is that it's probably cryptic metasomatism. And when I say cryptic metasomatism, it means that there should be a melt that is percolating those abyssal peridotites, but it's not doing very much to other elements. It's just the hydrogen. The hydrogen diffuses very fast. And the hydrogen concentrations can vary from, can diffuse from the melt to the abyssal peridotite, but it doesn't have the time to affect any other elements because they don't diffuse fast enough. I think that's the only process that can explain that. Cryptic metasomatism has also been suggested for other abyssal peridotites. So, when you think about abyssal peridotites, what happens to them in mid-ocean ridges, the atmospheric mantle melts here, and then it's a residue, but as the residue ascends to be emplaced basically at the seafloor, there's always magmas and melts being produced underneath. And so that piece of residual mantle is melted, but it's constantly repercolated by melt up until it's emplaced on the seafloor. So it's not very, it's not unexpected that we have some melt metasomatism in abyssal peridotite. We know that we have that. But what's interesting here is that we can see that this cryptic metasomatism in these abyssal peridotites, I'm going to skip that, in those abyssal peridotites, they have probably seen melts that have up to 1 to 2 weight% water. That's how we can explain those like very, very high water content in the CPX. And if you don't have a baseline for like what that means, typically the mid-ocean ridge basalt that we sample, remember that a big average of a big volume, those mid-ocean ridge basalt typically have 0.2, 0.3 weight% water. So this is much, much higher than the melt that we typically see at mid-ocean ridges. So those abyssal peridotites, they might actually record the passage of very hydrous melt for an oceanic ridge. And there's another place where such high melt content have been observed. I think it's in the Romanche area. And is that a fracture zone process? Maybe. But what we can say is that those abyssal peridotites are not as dry as what we thought they would be. We thought that after melting, they would just be like the lithosphere would be super dry, depleted of water. But what we're seeing is that actually because you have all those melts and potentially those hydrous melts repercolating the lithosphere, the oceanic lithosphere, you can actually rehydrate the oceanic lithosphere as you emplace it. So maybe it still contains more than 100 ppm water. And that actually could affect viscosity of the oceanic lithosphere if we consider that it's 100% dry, or if we consider that, based on the data, that it could have been rehydrated significantly as they ascended through the column. So let's see what this koala has remembered from this whole talk. So the take-home message here is that hydrogen enrichments are observed in abyssal peridotites that were supposed to be completely dry after melting. And what we observe is that the more depleted they are, the more water they have. So hydrogen seems to have been like sucked up by those hydrosmelt, especially in the depleted peridotites. What it means is that the residual oceanic lithosphere is not completely dry, as we thought. It could have more than 100 ppm water instead of estimates of like 20 ppm water, which is typically what has been used for the rheology of the oceanic lithosphere. And those data in the VMAP fracture zone show that we might record the presence of very hydrosmelt for an oceanic ridge, up to like 1 to 2 weight%. And so I think this is important to understand, what are the consequences for the viscosity of the oceanic lithosphere, which not really my job, but I think working with like geodynamicists to try to think about that could be very interesting. So the results of those studies are mainly based on my 2021 study, but if you're interested in that, you should also check out a whole bunch of other studies that have provided some preliminary data on water variation in abyssal peridotite. Warren and Harry, Lee, Schmadicke, Goss, and Hesse, all very interesting stories that, of course, have also inspired me to do this work. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to take any of your questions.